Hey y'all, welcome back to my channel. My name's Danielle and I'm the owner of Damn Fancy Creations and the Drunk Flamingo Glitter. If you guys are new to my channel, I do want to let you know that all of my links and groups are posted in the description below in case you guys want to check them out. Today's tutorial is another super fun Halloween drip tumbler. I am having loads of fun with doing different drip techniques that I haven't seen done before, and I hope you guys are enjoying them as well. Everything you see listed here is going to be covered in today's tutorial, but if you guys have a question about a technique that I did or materials that I used, please feel free to ask in the description and I will come back and answer it for you. But for now, we're going to go ahead and get started on this tutorial, and I hope you guys enjoy. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell for notifications so you guys stay up to date on my newest tutorial releases. Okay guys, so the very first thing we're going to do is remove the bottom of our tumbler. I like to use a metal putty knife and a hammer. We're just going to wedge that putty knife in between the bottom cap and the tumbler, and it pops off super easily. All of the bottom of the Steel Magnolia tumblers, you can remove the bottom cap. If you guys have not tried their tumblers, I do have a link and discount code in the description below. So we can just discard that cap. Removing the cap does not affect the integrity of the tumbler at all. It still keeps your drinks hot and cold. So for our vinyl, I'm using my Trick or Treater pattern vinyl. This is available on thedrunkflamingo.com. I love this pattern. I think it's super cute and fun. And since this is kind of divided, I went ahead and chose to do 2 rows of the Trick or Treaters on the top and 2 rows on the bottom. That way all of the little Trick or Treater characters are going to be on the tumbler and able to be seen. So I am just going ahead and trimming off any white edges that I see. So now that I have my little strips cut out, I am going to use a flat edge and a Sharpie. I'm just going to draw right down the flat edge a little bit at the top and a little bit at the bottom. That way I know that my vinyl is going to be straight when I apply it. I do have a tool from Cami Page Boutique from Brooke Tannehill. If you guys have not checked out her Tumbler Tools, definitely do it. I also have a link and discount code below for her Tumbler Tools if y'all are needing anything. So once we have all of our little edges trimmed off, I'm ready to apply the vinyl. So I am just going to trim a little bit of this backing off and attach the vinyl to the tumbler next to that straight line, and then wrap it around just to make sure that my line was straight. This one looks pretty good. So I am just going to smooth the vinyl down as I am slowly removing the backing. I like to use my little vinyl spatula scraper tool just to kind of smooth everything down. And as you're smoothing down your vinyl, you want to make sure that you don't have any air bubbles. With strips that are this small, it's pretty easy to get a bubble-free surface. Larger pieces are a little bit more difficult. So once I have my vinyl down, you guys can kind of see where the vinyl overlaps. But I personally like to use a piece of painter's tape as a guide just to make sure that the line I'm cutting is straight and it's not going to be all wonky. And then I just take my blade and cut that little vinyl piece and then pull the excess off. And I'm not worried about the bottom matching up too much because it is going to be covered with our drips. So now that the top strip is on, we're going to apply our bottom strip. I'm doing the same thing. We're just cutting a little piece of that backing off. And once we have this strip lined up, make sure everything looks good. We are going to go ahead and smooth this one down as well. Just smoothing out any air bubbles, making sure everything is straight. And then we're going to cut off the excess, smooth that down as well, apply our painter's tape and cut off the excess. And once we have our vinyl on, I am going to go straight into applying my drips. There's no need to epoxy over this. I didn't epoxy over it. I don't see why you would, but you can if you want to. I'm just making sure that everything is smooth and I don't have any air bubbles. So these are some little skeleton images that I'm going to use. These were not the exact size that I was going to use, but they were similar. So I just went ahead and used these as a guide. So I knew where I wanted my first set of drips to start. Or technically, this would be my second set of drips. So I am applying my painter's tape just to hold this place, so I know my little skeletons are going to fit within those blue lines. So there's going to be no epoxy applied above that blue line. And then we're going to apply our second drips, or our second guide, I should say, for our next set of drips. I'm starting it a little bit above the vinyl. That way I know for sure that all of the vinyl is going to be covered with epoxy and we're not going to have vinyl lines showing through. And once we get this wrapped, we are going to mix up some epoxy. So for my drips, I'm using Artistry's Fast Set. I like to use their Fast Set for drips. I think it has enough work time. If you do use Fast Set, once the epoxy starts to get warm, or a little bit more than warm, then it is ready to apply to the tumbler. I don't let Fast Set epoxy get as thick as regular epoxy because it does cure a lot quicker. So there is a learning curve if you want to use Fast Set epoxy for your drips, but after you work with it a couple times, you pretty much get your technique down just like you did when using regular epoxy. There's always a learning curve, but I like to use Fast Set because it is much quicker. I typically let my Fast Set sit for about 20 minutes, but I do stir it every 2 minutes or so. I don't just leave it for 20 minutes or it will flash cure, but if you stir it and mix it up, then it will not flash cure on you. So the first strips I'm going to apply are going to be Kelly Green. I chose green because there's a lot of green in the vinyl, little accent colors, the ribbon and the little girl's hair. I think there was a feather that was green, a few little green accents. So I thought that the green drips would kind of bring out that color a little bit more. This is Kelly Green Mica from Brambleberry. Brambleberry is really a soap and candle making company, but I have a lot of their micas because I used to make a lot of soap and wax melts. And their containers are huge. They're super affordable, but they don't have a ton of colors, but they are good for basic colors, and they are really good quality mica. So once our epoxy has sat for a little bit, I test it on the side of my cup, and when it just kind of barely drips a little bit, then I know it's ready to apply to my tumbler, and I'm just going to apply it right along that first tape line. Now, if this were regular epoxy, I would wait a little bit longer to apply my drips. With regular epoxy, I like to get it super thick like molasses so that it barely moves, because it does have a longer cure time. So the drips will drip further down once that epoxy cures. Fast set really starts to cure as soon as you put it on the cup. It doesn't move, even though it's still pretty liquid. So I am just now going around and putting drips where the drips are already starting to form. I would also suggest to keep your torch handy, because I do torch my drips, especially fast set, after I apply them, because this does help the drips drip a little bit further down the cup. So this is where I am torching my drips. I just torch it for 1 or 2 rotations, really focusing on the drips where I want them to drip a little bit further down. So once you're happy with how your drips are kind of flowing down the tumbler, we're going to remove the first strip of tape, and then we're going to let this set of drips cure completely. So we're just removing that first strip of painter's tape. And then we're going to let this cure. So once the first set of drips has cured, we're going to do the exact same thing for the top drips, but we're going to turn the tumbler upside down. So this epoxy has already been mixed up and has sat for a little while, and now we're going to apply it to the cup. The reason why you want to make sure that the first set of drips has cured is because if you turn your tumbler upside down to apply the second set of drips, then the first set of drips is going to flow the opposite direction, and you're not going to get good drips. They're going to be flat. They're not going to be as defined. So you want to make sure that the first set is dry. So we're doing the same thing, applying our little band of epoxy, and then we're applying some little epoxy balls and just kind of let them flow down the cup. And I'm just kind of smoothing out this band of epoxy because you don't really need it thick. And again, once you're happy with how these drips are looking and how they're kind of flowing down the tumbler, you're going to grab your torch again, torch it, help those drips smooth out and drip a little further down. And again, we're going to remove the painter's tape. And we're going to let this set of drips cure. So after both sets of drips have cured, this is what your drips are going to look like. Me and my friend Trina from Diamonds and Desk Glitter were talking about this the other day, that you want your drips to have like a little ball at the bottom of your drips. That is what good drips are going to look like. We don't want them flat against a tumbler. We don't want to prop the tumbler up and let the drips flow the opposite direction, because then they just kind of look deformed and not like something is actually dripping down your tumbler. So in order to have good drips, you want that little ball at the end of your drip, and you get that by really just setting your tumbler up and waiting, not flipping it back and forth. Don't put it on your tumbler turner. You just want to get your epoxy thick enough to where it just drips naturally down the tumbler and forms that little ball at the end. So we are ready for our second layer of drips. For this, again, we are using Artistry's Fast Set. If you guys have not tried them, I do have a link and discount code below. I am going to color these drips black, so I'm going to use Granite Shadow Dispersion Color, and I'm going to use a little bit of my Mother of Pearl Micah just to add a little shimmer to the drips. So once we add our colorant and get the color that we want, we're going to mix everything up and we're going to let it sit for a little while to thicken up. Again, we are still stirring every couple minutes just to make sure that everything is mixed up and it's not going to flash cure on us. So now that our epoxy is as thick as I want it, I'm ready to apply it to our tumbler. I am going to apply this right beneath the second tape line. And I'm going to fill this entire space so that I am 100% sure that all of that stainless is going to be covered. And once all of this stainless is covered, I am again going to take just little balls of epoxy and apply it where the drips are naturally starting to form, or wherever else I want a drip to start. And I will try to apply the black drips so that they fall in between the green drips. I don't want the black drips falling directly on top of the green drips. I want them kind of staggered so that we have a good amount of green and black on the tumbler. And once I get all of these drips on there, I am again going to take my torch and torch these drips just to help them fall down the tumbler. I also torch it to pop any bubbles because we did mix this quite a bit, so there are going to be a lot of air bubbles in the mixture, and we don't want those air bubbles forming towards the end of the curing process and cause a hole in our drips. So we want to try to pop those bubbles if we can. Once I get this epoxy on there, I'm going to go ahead and remove this tape line. And then again, we're going to let this black drip cure completely. So once that black drip has cured, we're going to do the exact same thing to the second black drip. So again, we have mixed this epoxy with Granite Shadow Dispersion Color and a little bit of my Mother of Pearl White Mica. And we're going to cover this stainless section completely. And once we cover the stainless, we're going to go back in and add little balls of epoxy where we want these drips to form if they're not forming already. And once we get all of these drips on there, we're going to take our torch and torch the drips, help them fall a little further down, and of course pop all of the bubbles. And we're going to remove the painter's tape, and once this black drip cures completely, all of our drips will be done, and we will be ready to move on to the middle section of our tumbler, which is applying the glitter and water slide. So now that all of our drips have cured, we are going to clean off any residue that is on the stainless part of the tumbler. I am just using alcohol, cleaning off these Sharpie marks, any residue that was on there from whatever I was touching. And then we are ready to paint our tumbler. I did tape off my drips with electrical tape. Painter's tape would get really kind of wrinkly and crease a lot if I was trying to apply that over the drips. Electrical tape is more flexible, so it worked really well for covering all of these drips. And if you know what you're going to do to the center of your tumbler, then you could probably spray paint this beforehand and save a little bit of time. I just wasn't sure what exactly I was going to do with this tumbler, so I just left it stainless. But I did decide I'm going to glitter and water slide the center. So I am going to paint it with Artistry's Color Fix paint in white and blush. And then I'm going to apply Pinka Colada and Drunk Ghost glitter. Drunk Ghost is a new color that is not released yet, but it will be bagged up and released this week, so be on the lookout for that. I am just going to use the Artistry Color Fix paint to base my tumbler. Since this is stainless, I am going to do 2 coats. The first one I'm going to do very thin just to get a good kind of base color going. If you guys have not tried Artistry's Color Fix paints, I definitely suggest them. They are a 3-in-1 paint. They are a paint primer, and they also have a glitter glue built in. So this makes base painting and glittering in one step super easy, especially with the colder months coming up. I know a lot of you guys are looking for alternatives to spray paint. And I do like these a lot because you can go ahead and apply a second coat and it's not going to remove the paint from the first coat. These paints also blend really well together. I've used these for a few of my summer tumblers as well, where I just hand painted them. And I like to use a soft brush to apply the paints. I typically have whatever brush I have laying around. This is just a makeup brush that I have that I usually just use for paint and not makeup. And I wanted the center just to have a little bit of pink in it, just to kind of tie in the pink on the vinyl. So I am just kind of adding a little bit of this blush. And then once I have my colors on there, I'm going to take my tea strainer. This is typically how I apply all of my glitter that is gradient or ombre, or where I just need a little bit and don't need it too thick. So I'm just going to tap this Drunk Ghost. It is a really pretty white opal glitter. And I'm just going to sprinkle this in the center. And then I'm going to go in with Pinka Colada. It is one of my favorite light pinks that I offer. And we're going to apply Pinka Colada on both edges. So that way we get kind of a pretty mix of white and pink. And once I have all of my glitter on there, we're going to go ahead and remove the electrical tape while the paint is still wet. And then we're going to let this dry completely, which I would say it usually takes about 30 minutes to dry, but I like to wait a couple hours just to be sure. And then I'm going to spray seal it with Rust-Oleum 2 times really well, just to keep that glitter in place, and so it won't transfer to our drips or vinyl during the epoxy process. So now that our clear sealer has dried, we're going to epoxy. I mixed up, I think, about 25 mils. I wasn't too sure how much epoxy this was going to take with all of these drips. And I am going to start on the bottom half of the tumbler, epoxy that really good, really getting in between those drips. And I do get asked all the time, how do you keep epoxy from pooling or gathering in between the drips? And so my suggestions are to make sure that your epoxy layer is not super thick. If your epoxy layer is really thick, you're going to have pools of epoxy because the epoxy is going to flow, and once it hits those drips, it's not going to have anywhere to go. So make sure your epoxy layer is not too thick. I also go in between the drips and kind of clean them out. So you will see me kind of put my finger in between the drips and kind of pull out the epoxy. And I am just getting all of those globs of epoxy out. We don't want them between there. So right here, you can see that I am just pulling any globs of epoxy out. And I'm just making it really thin in between these drips. They're still covered with epoxy, but it is a very thin layer. And then I just kind of go back and smooth everything out, make sure that everything is covered. And then I'm going to apply a little bit more in the center of my tumbler. Make sure the center is covered really well. Since this is glitter, we want to make sure all of those glitter grains are covered. And then I'm also kind of smoothing out the middle as best I can, because I don't want the middle to be wavy either. And then I am going to torch this really well. If a tumbler has drips, I will typically torch it more than once just to make sure that the little bubbles in between where the drips are get popped. And I will say that it's pretty unavoidable not to get any bubbles in between drips. That epoxy is going to be a little bit thicker, but you can try your best to get as much out as you can. Another tip I like to use is a little silicone tool. I always have a couple of these handy downstairs in the garage, and I just scrape out any pulled epoxy and just wipe it back into my little medicine cup. I just kind of dig it out, and since this is a silicone tool, the epoxy will just pop right off of it when it's dry. I believe I do have a link to these little tools in the description. If you guys need any, they're super handy. I use silicone tools for this. I use them for clay sculpting, lots of different things you can use them for. So those are just some tips on how I keep my drips from being overrun with epoxy. Just clean it out with my fingers and then just go back and clean them out with a silicone tool. I will torch it one more time just to make sure everything is smooth, and then we will be ready for our next step. So after our epoxy has cured, we will be ready to apply our decals. I did sand this really well. There were some glitter grains I needed to smooth out, but I did go and spray the center with Rust-Oleum 2 times clear. If you need to sand your tumbler, just spray it with Rust-Oleum clear. That way when you apply your water slide, you're not going to see the lines underneath the decals. You have to have a glossy surface in order to apply your water slide. So these are my little water slide images that I chose. These images are available on thedrunkflamingo.com. These are just some fun little Halloween images I put together. And I just like to wet the backing of my decals. I don't submerge them in water. I use Sunnyscopia Waterslide. It is the best I've used. The images release super easy and super quick from the backing. I wet my tumbler a little bit, and then I just slid the image on. And once we get the image positioned how we want it, I just like to take a microfiber cloth and I like to squeeze the water out from underneath it. When the water squeezes out from the side, the cloth absorbs the water, so your tumbler isn't going to have beads of water all over it. It immediately absorbs into the cloth. And then we're going to apply the other 2 decals the exact same way. With Waterslide, you do want to make sure that all of the water is squeezed out from underneath the slides. If the slides dry and there's still water trapped up underneath it, there will appear to be like air bubbles, little air pockets underneath the water slides that could affect the look of it after you epoxy, and we don't want that. We just want to go ahead and make sure that all of the water is squeezed out from underneath it. I would wait at least 30 to 45 minutes to make sure your slides are completely dry. You can tell when they dry, they kind of have a brittle feel to them versus a kind of rubbery feel to them. And once we get our water slides on, positioned how we want them, I am going to go back and detail with some pinstripes. Oh, and in case I did not say, I do seal my water slides with Rust-Oleum 2 times. I just spray one really good coat, and that's typically good enough. So when I cut pinstripes, I typically cut full sheets or half a sheets of whatever color I'm cutting, and I typically cut in sizes 0.07, 0.05, and 0.03. That way I have a good variety of sizes, and I can also layer them if I need to. So I chose this kind of pinky, orange, red, opal shift vinyl for the first vinyl that I put down. And then I'm going to go back and add a really thin black pinstripe to the center of this vinyl. And I promise it never fails. My head is always in the way. So this first line of vinyl, I believe, was the 0.07, and now I'm going in with the 0.03 black. And I typically always layer my pinstripes. I just think it gives a little more definition. And once we have these pinstripes on, I am going to take this down to my turner for the final 2 layers of epoxy. I typically always do 2 layers of epoxy over decals just to make sure that everything is sealed in super well. And once your final layers of epoxy are on, we're going to do our little glitter butt. I just mixed up about 20 mils of epoxy. It may have been a little bit more. I didn't need quite that much. I just added a little bit of mimosa. It is my most favorite gold glitter. And I'm just applying this to the exterior cavity on the bottom. And once I have this bottom cavity filled, I'm going to add a little bit more glitter. I'm going to add mint julep, which is a green. And then I'm going to add a little bit of autumn sweater, which is a chunky, just to break up the color a little bit from one cavity to the next. And once we have this all mixed up, I'm going to add it to the larger cavity on the bottom. I'm going to pop all of the bubbles, and then when this layer of epoxy cures, I'm going to come back and add a thin layer of clear epoxy. That way the bottom of the tumbler is just as slick and glass-like as the rest of the tumbler. And once that layer of epoxy cures, your tumbler will be complete. Here are some finished pictures of the tumbler. I love how this turned out. I think the multi-drips are super unique, really, really fun. I have not seen this done before, and I hope you guys enjoyed. If you guys get inspired by this tutorial and make one of your own, please post in my groups because I love to see what you guys come up with. If y'all enjoyed this tutorial or learned something new, please be sure to like, subscribe, and share. Don't forget to catch the next video coming up that was picked just for you. As always, if you're looking for more tips, tricks, or tutorial, be sure to check out my tutorial group or my mentorship group that are both linked in the description. Thanks for watching.